Good. Excellent. Okay, well, let's get going. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Rachel Sandford. I'm a reader in the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences here, and presenting with my colleague Oliver Hooper today around this topic of realising the developmental potential of physical education and youth sports. And this is an area that really covers a lot of the research that Ollie and I do, and we're really excited to be able to share some of our work with you today. So we always like to start with a little bit of an overview just to keep us right, to make sure that we know what we're doing and so you know what to expect as well. And there are 4 sections that we will run through with you today. The first one really is setting the scene. And we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of the power of sports. And we'll unpick that a little bit to see what it means and set a sort of a rationale for what we're looking at. And then the next section, we'll start to unpick that a little bit and look behind that rhetoric and that idea to see what the argument in and around sports and development for young people is. Now, Ollie and I, when we do our work is very much based on a youth voice perspective, underpinned by that idea that we need to hear from and understand and listen to the voices of young people. So we'll have a section that really brings some of that research in and talks about some of the ideas and the experiences of young people. And then we'll finish by thinking a little bit about what works. We like also to have a strength-based perspective to some of the work that we do. And we'll focus in particular in that last section on conditions that support positive impacts. So that's what we're hoping to achieve today. And we're hoping to be able to do that within the time that we've got, to not get too distracted on the way through. And hopefully, as you go through, there'll be some questions that you want to think about, some of the ideas that come across when you're doing that. We'll encourage you to think a little bit about the questions you want to ask us, and we're happy to have some good space at the end to do that. So first of all, we want to start by thinking about this idea of the power of sports and the idea of sport for development. Now, we're looking here at this idea of sports. We'll also talk today about the idea of physical activity, of physical education, of school sports, and we could do a whole separate talk about what each of these areas are. But for the purpose of today, what we really want to think about is really this idea of a collection of activities in and around sports, physical activity and physical education, and how young people's engagements with each of these can support their development. So we're not really going to get into too much of the differentiation or the definition of these ideas. We just want to really think about them as a whole. If we think about this idea broadly, then of sport for development, then what we see is really a strong belief within society of the potential for sport, for physical activity and related activities to bring about benefits for young people. So their participation in these activities can bring them something that helps them to develop in a particular way. And if we're thinking particular here about young people, then we will focus in some of our discussions around that space of physical education and school sports, because that is a context in which a lot of young people come into contact with these activities. And the idea, obviously, within that is that they are therefore an avenue to accessing the benefits that come about through participation and engagement in these activities. And if we think about this, and we can think about this and look at this through the history of research in this area, then we can understand why development in and through sport has become quite deeply embedded. You look at some of the way in which the whole movement of sport within schools came about, and the idea of having that ability to develop the kind of values that we want the youth population to have. But over time, these have become so deeply embedded that to some extent, they're a kind of received wisdom that sport is good for development. We all know that. We don't challenge it, perhaps. And it's become something of a powerful rhetoric. And that rhetoric underpins a lot of action. We see that in relation to the development of particular policies, of initiatives, of interventions, and we see it feed into a lot of the public and political debate that sits around the idea of why young people should be able to engage in sport and physical activity and physical education. And just as a challenge, and I often set this as a challenge for my students, if you try Googling just that phrase, the power of sports, then you see just how many responses you can find for that. And if you want to, I think the last time Ollie and I looked, it was about 1.8 trillion responses to that. If you want to spend the next 40 minutes going through the first few of those, feel free. But we'd also like you to listen to what we're saying too. But we can see just from that finding that actually this is a really powerful message. And if you're doing some of that Googling around the power of sports, you might invariably come across this quote. Now, I've read a few personal statements in my time, and often students who are interested in sport courses will fall back on this idea of the power of sports. And obviously this quote from Nelson Mandela, which was delivered in relation to the Rugby World Cup in the South African context, talks about the real power of sport to change the world. And this is really perhaps personifying or embodying some of those real ideas around the power of sports. So the power to inspire, the power to unite, the power to bring hope, to break down barriers. A really kind of powerful message, and one that has found its way into perhaps the rationale for why we need to think about sports as a developmental tool, particularly for young people. And if you think yourself, perhaps when you think of that term power of sport, what comes to mind? And there might be lots of different images and ideas that come to mind when we think about the power of sports. We might think about some of those mega events, those big activities and events and things that happen in terms of like the Olympics and world championships that really bring about experiences, and that might be something that could inspire. We might think about the power of sport to help promote inclusion, to break down barriers, to be able to include people in different types of sports. For young people, it might be about having fun, about spending time with their teammates. It might be about identities, shared identities and national identities. And how we think about this when we think about the power of sport might depend a little bit on where we sit ourselves, how we position ourselves. What are our own experiences? So the lens that we look through when we're trying to understand what the power of sport is might shape how we then read it. But it is important also to think about this a little bit. So is it simply that we should just accept that physical education, that sport, that physical activity for development is just a given? Is that right? There is certainly a lot of support for the view. There's also much research that points to this being a good thing, but do we perhaps need to think about this a little more critically? Because we could ask some quite challenging questions. So are engagements with sport always positive? Are they positive for everybody? Does every young person experience sport and physical activity, or perhaps physical education in particular, in the same way? If we think back to some of our own experiences within school, physical education, can we recognise where this wasn't the case? Do some of the impacts of engagement vary by individual? Do they vary by context? And do we need to think a little bit about where things work, how do they work, and what are those right or best conditions for growth? And importantly from our perspective, we're also interested not just in what the public view is, what the political view is, what the policymaker view is, but what do young people think about when they think about that power of sport? What does it mean to them? And this is something that we're really going to try and get to the heart of over the next few minutes in the course of this lecture. So some questions to get you thinking, and questions also that we as researchers often consider when we're looking at this kind of area of research. Okay, so if we move into our second section, and I like to have these section breaks because it reminds us that we're moving through in a positive trajectory. So we've thought a little bit about this idea of the power of sports and remember sport broadly. and what some of the belief is around that. And in this next section, what we want to do a little bit is to think about what is the argument, what's the rationale behind this, what's the thinking in terms of how engagement with and participation in sports, physical activity and physical education brings about development. And we need to think about this perhaps in a number of different ways. But we start from the point that these kind of activities might themselves be useful vehicles through which development can be encouraged. If we think about the idea of participation, and as we said, it's long been associated with benefits. And we see this particularly with benefits for children and young people. The argument being that engaging in those activities can in some way affect a positive change. It can bring about something that is positive for young people. And when we see and look at some of the writing around this, both within the research, academic research, also within policy discussions, then we see some of this idea underpin broader discussions about youth development. And again, when we think about where young people mostly engage perhaps with some of these activities, then it brings us back to physical education and school sports. And physical education, of course, is a compulsory component of the curriculum, certainly within the UK and in many countries. And so we know that that is an opportunity that all young people should get to engage in sport activity and different types of experiences that are physical. And those contexts are really important in terms of shaping young people's development, but importantly, the idea of a holistic development. And there are a couple of points that we might sort of see as sitting behind this that are worth considering. So why is it that it's those kind of activities that are seen to bring about development? Well, firstly, we could argue that it is the nature of the activities. And Martinek and Hallison, talking about this, argued that to some extent we can think about the nature of activity as being something that is active, interactive, collaborative, and that in that respect, it brings the possibility of exploring and practicing different kinds of skills and values. And you see here they talk about teamwork and goal setting and conflict resolution and so on. But also if we think again about that idea of holistic learning, then what we can see is that the developmental capacity of things, particularly like physical education and school sports, are relevant because it gives a somewhat unique opportunity for young people to have the kind of experience that enhances their learning across different domains. So across the physical, the psychomotor, the cognitive and affective domains. And this means that actually in terms of development, we are having a much bigger impact, perhaps because of the ability to work in different areas. So again, if we think about these kind of sports, and here we'll talk about PE, PA, and youth sport, and we'll bring them all together a little bit, because the various benefits that are cited within the literature are many and varied. And you might expect there is a physical component to that, but we also see benefits in terms of social skills, in terms of communication, in terms of leadership. And we also see real opportunities to develop in terms of values as well. And increasingly we are seeing the opportunities there to encourage young people's development in positive, and we would argue perhaps socially acceptable ways. And these are being connected, certainly within the educational context, with some of this idea of citizenship, of the idea of being a good citizen, playing the game, abiding by the rules, contributing in a way that helps yourself and others. We can perhaps draw on some of the recent debates that we've seen in and around physical education and school sport in the UK to tell us a little bit more about this. So, for example, some of the discussion around the capacity for those activities to teach life skills, to teach the kind of skills that can help young people in different contexts. To also support young people's readiness for life beyond school. And to some extent, those life skills fall into that, but it's also some of that holistic learning that underpins some of that thinking too. And also this idea of sports to build character, and particularly competitive sports. And to some extent, that character is often linked with a related term of resilience. And some of what we look at there, and some of the theoretical framework that sits with this, is associated with the theoretical approach of positive youth development, which is one that Ollie and I draw on in much of the research that we use. And this positive youth development movement has gained, significant momentum over the last few years. And part of the reason that we see it as being particularly valuable is that it is a strengths-based conception of youth development. And it perhaps therefore offers something slightly different to what have been more traditional deficit reduction approaches. So we don't start necessarily in this particular perspective by seeing young people as having problems that we need to fix, but more that having resources that we can work with them to help aid their own positive development. And the quote by Damon here is quite nice in sort of really helping to show that what positive youth development as a theoretical lens does is that it encourages us to recognize the potential that young people have, rather than the incapacities and the things that we might perhaps need to fix for them or give them so that they are better able to manage. The interesting thing here is that obviously this positive youth development movement isn't necessarily, or wasn't necessarily, developed just in relation to physical activity, physical education and sport, but it is increasingly being associated with it. And one of the models that you might see or might have heard of in relation to this is the 5C model of positive youth development. And this is one that identifies 5 key characteristics that are seen to build and paint a picture of young people's development. And you can see those here: the idea of competence, of developing confidence, being connected to others, having that idea of character, and also being able to have some of that values base as well, being able to show that caring and compassion. And these are things that sit very well, as we can see, with some of the research specifically around physical education and sport contexts, because they're all things that are seen to be potential to develop through those activities. The value for us, though, in terms of thinking about this, is that what positive youth development gives us, and what some of that idea of development in and through sport gives us, is a recognition that learning isn't just within the context, but it is transferable. So a core assets or resources that you develop through activities can contribute not just to what you know and are able to do now, but what you can then transfer into the future. And as it says here, that can support your future well-being. In that respect, what we can see is that some of that development that young people get in and through sport has what we would call exchange value. That it's not simply valuable in and of itself, but that they are able then to exchange it in different ways and use it in different ways. If we come back to this idea of life skills, we can talk about this idea of transferring life skills in different ways. And we can therefore see perhaps that physical capital that young people might develop in sport and activity contexts can be transferred by them into social capital, connections with others, or cultural capital, the capacity to go on and gain different qualifications, for example, and even educational capital in being able to then apply that in different ways. And we can see then again some of that idea of increasing young people's capacity to be resilient, perhaps, in difficult circumstances. And that's particularly relevant, and Ollie will come on in a moment to talk about some of the work that we've done, that some of this idea of youth development is particularly relevant for those young people who might be marginalised or considered more at risk or vulnerable within the contexts in which they are. We would argue that, again, we need to recognise that idea of learning is not simply about gaining resources. It's not about filling up an empty vessel. It's not about just gaining skills. It's about the experience as well, and recognizing that learning is embodied. And if we think about physical education and sport in particular, then the body is central to practice. And therefore that embodied learning is something that's really enhanced. And it's not simply what you are able to acquire that is important, but the process that you go through in connection with others, that is really important. And we like this idea of Hager and Hodkinson talking about learning by becoming. It's a real aspect of developing a sense of self. We can therefore see, perhaps, if we again look at this idea of the physical education and school sport context, that there is perhaps a special role of that subject to play within young people's educational journeys. And there's various different that we can pull on, or quotes that we can look at that might give us some support for this. But there's just a couple for you here, talking about the things that those particular subjects can bring for young people. So developing a whole raft of skills that are valuable in terms of transferable, translational skills. So confidence, ambition, respect for the rules, winning and losing, being able to have positive relationships. But also thinking not just about what young people are able to get through that experience, but also the nature of that experience of learning. So we often see physical education identified as having a unique place within the curriculum. The fact that it is a physical activity, that it takes place in different contexts, that it allows young people to learn and do things differently. And as we see here from this quote, the idea of the subject matter, the learning environment, and the kind of relationships and interactions that young people can have with their teachers and their peers makes it a somewhat unique experience and offers some of that opportunity for holistic learning. Now, we deliberately haven't strayed too much into policy or curriculum, but I think it is important to recognise as well that if we do look at that in relation to physical education as a school subject, then we can see some of that rhetoric of development in and through sport and physical activity embedded within the curriculum, certainly within the national curriculum for physical education in England. And similarly, some of the work that we've done with colleagues in the other home nations of the UK will see some of this rhetoric come through about different areas of learning. But certainly the NCPE talks about opportunities to compete, to build character, to embed values, and to have some of that holistic learning experience. This perhaps all gives and builds that idea that there is certainly potential for development for young people participating in and through sport, physical activity, and physical education. But it is important, again, to recognise that there is a degree of planning needed here. So there is potential that can be realised. But as McQuaig and colleagues talk about in some of their work around values-based education, there are a diverse range of factors that need to come into play. Equally, we can recognise through some of the positive youth development literature that actually development in and through physical education, physical activity and sport is, as Holt puts it, possible, but not inevitable. And that brings about some challenges for us if we think about that power of sport rhetoric and perhaps how we might see it as something that is taken for granted. So as it says here, the balance of evidence is that young people can learn things like life skills by participation in sport, but only really when sport is developed and delivered in a way that is appropriate to them. And that's where I'm going to pass over to Ollie, and he's going to talk a little bit about a youth perspective.
I'm just going to try and wrangle control from Rachel so I can click through on the slides.
I'll allow it.
Great, thank you. Okay. So, as Rachel said, I'm going to talk now a little bit to some of our recent research, sharing young people's perspectives around, I guess, the developmental potential of sport and the positive experiences that it might facilitate. And as Rachel mentioned, a lot of our work has been with young people who might be considered marginalised. for whom there is an assumption that these developmental benefits that sport might bring might be particularly beneficial. And so with that in mind, we're going to think about youth voice, which is a key thread that runs through much of our work. And it's an agenda in PE and youth sport and education more broadly that has gained momentum in recent years, whereby young people are increasingly being recognised as having capacity. And in line with that their thoughts, feelings, and experiences should be considered in those matters that affect them. And this is enshrined in policy as part of the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, whereby Article 12 states that young people should have a say in all matters that affect them. And what we see then off the back of this sort of growing agenda is a growing appreciation of the importance of recognising young people's voices, given that they really are the experts in their own lives. They know better than we do what those experiences are like. So when we're thinking about how we might enhance experiences and how we might bring about these developmental benefits, young people are probably the best people to go to ask about that. And as Rachel and colleagues put together really nicely here, what we've seen is this sort of shift or movement towards young people being viewed as these competent and skilled social agents. So they're able to interact with others, to engage in those social processes, and as a result of that, to reflect, to understand and then articulate those experiences, to share with others, to give an insight into their worlds. And what we've seen then off the back of this agenda is a real growth in opportunities. And I'd say it's a welcome growth in opportunities for youth voice to be heard across various aspects of young people's lives. And of interest to us today, it is sort of those lives within the PE and school sport domain. But whilst this is all really positive, what we have to recognise is that sort of listening to voices might be a little bit more tricky. Listening is one thing. Hearing and actually hearing is perhaps another, and trying to hear young people's voices is sometimes easier said than done, such that some colleagues have argued that the ability to hear young people's voices is perhaps best considered as a pedagogical skill. It's something that takes a bit of mastery, that's developed and learned over time as practitioners develop those skills of working with young people. And another challenge we face with respect to listening to young people's voices is the fact that not all young people's voices are heard equally. Those more able are often those that are heard more within these contexts. And so it's really important that we recognise that voices in this space can be forced or they can be silenced. And that needs to be given due consideration when we are trying to find out about young people's experiences, because we don't just want to hear the same young people and the ones that speak the loudest. It's also worth noting that voice isn't just audible spoken word as I'm talking to you now. Voice can be conveyed in a range of different ways. And some examples that we've used in our recent work include things like character creation, where we ask young people to share with us, what would a really positive experience look like for a young person in your context? It might include mapping, where young people can share with us the spaces in which they engage in activities within their contexts. Or it might include mind mapping, where they think about a particular topic and share that with us. These are just a few examples, but others might include things like using drawings, photos or cartoons, using drama or plays, blogs, vlogs, podcasts and videos. There's a whole range of ways in which young people can share their experience with us that we might capture under that youth voice umbrella, but that isn't necessarily always spoken word. But there's also a danger to youth voice in that if we hear things, sometimes they might share that it's not positive or things that we think might be working on. And so as practitioners or those interested in working with young people in this space, we also need to be prepared to make changes in line with what young people are telling us. We'd hope they're having those positive experiences based on the practice that we're delivering, but sometimes things might need to change. So it's important that practitioners are sort of ready to engage with that. And with that idea in mind, we're going to move on now to think about some of our recent work, some insight from a couple of studies we've done. So this is taken from the Right to be Active study involving Rachel, Tom Cornby and myself, whereby we looked at care experience from people's physical activity and sport engagements across England. And as part of this, we took some of the data we generated and created these sort of comic strips. They're a composite piece based on lots of different young people's experiences. But as I'm talking now, I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to have a look at this comic strip and maybe have a think about what this might be telling us. There's a story behind this. I'd like to have a think about what that might be. Now, as Rachel will tell you, I'm not comfortable with silence. So as you're thinking about what that story might be, I'm going to start talking to it a little bit. And this is perhaps one of those more negative experiences that was shared with us as part of the project. And we themed or titled this comic strip New Boy. And this is about a young person who'd been in care, who'd moved placements, and as a result had to move schools. And so that first image there perhaps shows some of that apprehension about moving to a new context and that idea of transition being challenging for young people. In the next space, PE was often, for young people who've been in care, seen to be a space where they could really shine, where they could show what they could do, where they could achieve in that school context. Which you can kind of see there in that character towards the left. He's got baggy kit. It doesn't fit. It's what's left over in the sort of the spare kit box. It's that idea of fitting in, or perhaps here standing out and for the wrong reasons, comes to the fore. Often care experiential people might be taken out of that PE space for official meetings, and it's really important to make sure that they have the opportunity there to remain engaged in that space when it can be developmental for them. And linked to that, often they might have to leave early or go at the end of the school day straight away in a taxi that might be shared. And so they can't always take part in some of those extracurricular opportunities. So whilst this might depict a negative experience, what we can start to do here is unpick some of those elements that might facilitate a positive one. So that idea of supporting transitions, of helping to build an identity through things like kit, providing opportunity to engage in that school space, and making sure that young people have that sense of belonging. If we think then about another story from this, and this is kind of flipping it to a more positive one, again, I'll let you have a look at this image and sort of see what you make of this particular story. But as I say, this is perhaps a more positive one, and this was where an older young person was sort of reflecting back on an experience of when they were younger at school. They had some success in athletics, and that all started when a teacher, not even a PE teacher, suggested that going to an after-school club might be good for them. So we can see already there that idea or that rhetoric of the power of sport for good coming to the fore there, and not even just from PE teachers. This girl went along, she engaged, she had that support of the PE staff, and she went along and won a gold medal at the county championships. So again, we can see here some of those positive elements coming out around being able to have an achievement or a sense of accomplishment in PE, having opportunities and relevant support from significant others. And again, that idea of being with peers. We're going to move now to think about another project, another recent one looking at physical education in alternative provision contexts. Some work done by Tom Cornby, Anthony Marr, and myself. And again, here we're going to start maybe with a sort of a composite narrative taken from a few different young people's stories. But this one, as the image kind of suggests, depicts perhaps a more negative experience. And here the young person recounts how that PE environment can be noisy. People might shout at them. Others might boo them. They might not feel particularly good in that space, and people might ridicule them or make fun of them. And again, there we can see that importance of positive experience in that making sure the environment is right. And Rachel will come on later to this idea of the conditions being right, but that environment within which these sporting opportunities or these physical education opportunities take place is really key, and getting it right can be difficult. And then again, to flip this round to another more positive one, what we can see here from this young person is that PE actually is a really positive space for them. They like it when there's a social element, when they can interact with others, including the teacher, I would argue here, and they're getting that relevant support. They can be with friends, working teams, and then quite importantly, towards the end, they feel that they can contribute, that they're wanted and they're important in that space. And that sense of accomplishment is really, really important to pull out. So what this research highlights quite nicely here is the importance of relationships, that social element of PE, and the importance of being able to evidence sort of accomplishments or achievements in that space. Now, when we think then about facilitating these positive experiences, what we'd argue is that voice can be a really powerful tool here in elucidating those negative experiences, but also what makes for a positive one. So by engaging with young people's voices, what we can look to do is identify what makes for a positive experience when we're getting those conditions right, which might then sort of better set us up to achieve some of those developmental outcomes within these contexts. And if we're thinking then about what might be some of those key features to positive experiences, some work by Benny and colleagues suggests there's 4 key ones. Now, I'd argue there's more, but these 4 are perhaps a really useful starting point. So social interaction being key. And as some of the sort of case studies I've just shared with you previously talk to, that idea of being able to interact and engage with both peers and teachers in positive and productive ways is really important. Enjoyment, feeling like you can achieve in that space and that you are having fun, often again with those friends, so we can see connections here between these different features. But there's sufficient challenge. And this is definitely something that got talked to within both of those studies, whereby we sometimes can think competition can be bad. And don't get me wrong, if it's done in the wrong ways, it certainly can be for young people. But young people want to feel that they are being challenged at a level that's relative to them. And then lastly, this idea of skill development. And it links again to the notion of being able to achieve and those positive accomplishments in this space. And linking back to some of Rachel's earlier points, this isn't just physical development, or it certainly shouldn't just be physical skill development, but also those wider social, cognitive, emotional, and affective skills that can be developed so usefully within these contexts if the conditions are right. So what we'd argue here, I guess, is that young people's perspectives really are key, because what we also have to note is that they will have diverse needs. And as Rachel will come on to, that idea of a one-size-fits-all model doesn't really work within this space. And that links us then perhaps to this useful idea of personally relevant learning, whereby if we focus on that idea, which draws our attention to young people's diverse needs, we can perhaps better look to try and accommodate these within those PE and school sport spaces. Benefit of the idea of personally relevant learning is that it recognizes and makes connections to the social, the cultural, and the economic influences that shape young people's experiences in that space. And so I'm going to hand over at that point there, and I've talked a little bit already about this idea of the right conditions, and Rachel's going to pick up there and talk through that a little bit more.
Thanks, Holly. If I press stop share, am I going to close everything, or am I just getting control back? I'll try clicking and see if that works. There we go. We're good. This is why we need a double act, because technology and I aren't necessarily always the best of friends. Well, we did close this lecture really with this final section, thinking a little bit about the conditions that best support positive development in and through sport, physical activity, and physical education for young people. Now, we know a lot about what doesn't work, and that includes things like quick fix approaches, things that perhaps have more of a deficit approach, seeing something that is a problem and we need to fix it. This one-size-fits-all approach that Ollie has also talked about, the idea of perhaps a particular intervention being put in place that is the same for everybody. And you have diverse learners, some of whom will benefit and some of whom will not. We also see that the idea of piecemeal provision, things happening in isolation and disconnected, also creates that environment in which we don't see the opportunity for development maximised. Also, sometimes the idea of just an over-reliance on key individuals to lead and drive particular initiatives. And sometimes those initiatives and interventions that we see are things that perhaps don't necessarily take into context the local culture, perhaps religious or political contexts in which we are trying to engage and develop young people. We've talked in some of our work recently around this idea of the snatch and grab style of research. So we know that if we are just looking to jump in, get young people's views and go again, that's also not necessarily something that helps to identify or really support young people's development. And ultimately, a lot of this comes down to perhaps a failure to establish connections and partnerships with individuals. What it highlights really for us is the importance of the social. And social processes are things that are really important when we want to consider young people's development in and through sport, physical activity, and physical education. We saw through the case studies that we've just had a look at that social connections are really important and that these are really significant in affecting some of those positive outcomes that we want. And they need to be not just connections that are superficial, perhaps, but that are meaningful, that allow genuine opportunities for individuals to connect with each other, for young people to connect with each other, to connect with adults, to be linked to the community. And so lots of different people are important within that context. And in our work, we talked to the idea of significant others as being really central to positive youth development in these kind of contexts. So Petipas and colleagues who write within that field of positive youth development argue that it's all about relationships, and relationships are really central. And we need to be able to create environments in which we allow the possibility to both establish those relationships and sustain them, to maintain them over time. And these are really conditions that help to link to positive youth development. And again, if we go back to think about some of the work of Lerner and colleagues, remember they brought about that 5C model of positive youth development. They talk about the idea that people are the most important asset that we have within those positive youth development contexts. And this idea of meaningful and supportive relationships is therefore a key part of that. We also need, though, opportunities within the activities that are offered, the opportunity to build skills. And those are both those perhaps hard skills. You know, we can think in the physical education and sports space as being those skills of being able to have a physical skill, being able to develop and take part in a particular activity, but also, and I don't particularly like this term, but the idea of soft skills. We would prefer to use the idea of life skills or transferable skills. Some of those ideas around leadership and confidence and social skills, for example. And in particular, there is this idea of pro-social skills being important. That idea of the social is really important in affecting change. So being able to build some of those pro-social skills is really valuable for young people. And increasingly, you know, post-pandemic in particular, the idea of physical education and school sport contributing to a recovery curriculum is quite heavily focused on the capacity for those activities to bring not just health benefits, but benefits in terms of social and emotional learning and health and well-being. And importantly, we need to be able to encourage transfer of skills between contexts, as well as encourage young people to be able to access opportunities that is a genuine, authentic participation in an activity that they are interested in. At this point, I'm going to let Ollie take us into the last couple of slides just to finish up our discussion today.
Control back from Rachel once more. Perfect.
Then I'll allow it, that's fine.
So we thought we'd want to leave you with, I guess, a few key thoughts. We've got kind of 3 key implications that we'd like to leave you with. And then we've got a little framework we might like to just put forward before we sort of share some further information if you're interested. And so I guess if you haven't got the message already, that social element is so key to this. And those personal connections within that PE and school sport space are so important when it comes to trying to realize these developmental outcomes for young people. So making sure that we have the right people in front of those young people and that they're engaging with them in the right ways is really, really key here. The next key element that we need to think about is that idea of planning for positive impact and making sure that this is intentional. So as Rachel mentioned earlier on, this doesn't just happen by chance. If we want to bring about positive developmental outcomes for young people through PE and school sport, we need to make sure that we plan for that. And we need to employ these deliberate techniques to try and bring out life skills, values, and so on. That might be the use of pedagogical models or particular pedagogical approaches. But these things don't generally just happen by chance. It comes down to sort of careful consideration in relation to pedagogy, which links me on to the final point in that respect. So that involves practitioners giving that careful thought to pedagogical approaches. And within that, what we might argue is there's perhaps a need to have a focus on voice. So how can we facilitate young people's voices through this process to make sure that they can inform what we're doing in the way of pedagogy, to make sure that these experiences are positive and to maximize that potential for realizing those positive developmental outcomes. And so I guess what we wanted to propose at the end of this perhaps is a useful framework, we think, potentially, based on some of the work we've done with other colleagues, including Tom Cornby. And that's around this notion of trauma-aware pedagogies. Now, these were developed drawing on youth voice insight from some of our work with care experience from people who might be particularly likely to have experienced trauma at some point in their lives. But what we'd argue is that this framework, and you can see it on the screen here, is beneficial for all learners, for all young people, and that the principles of enacting this trauma-aware approach might be really useful to employ across the PE and school sport context. What we're not trying to do here is reinvent the wheel. And those of you that are engaged in working with young people in these PE and school sport spaces will probably look at this model and recognize things that you already do in your practice, which is really positive. In many ways, you could argue this is simply good pedagogy. But what we argue is that by putting this as a framework, it might help us to be a little bit more considerate of how we intentionally work towards realizing some of these aspects of practice in real life for those young people that we're working with. So I guess to reiterate one more time, these positive outcomes that can be achieved through PE and school sport don't just happen by chance. We've got to work for them. And they are somewhat reliant on those constructive and collaborative engagements of practitioners with young people to shape some of those meaningful encounters to bring about some of those benefits that we talked about at the top of this lecture. So hopefully you've enjoyed that lecture from us today. Thank you for listening with us. It's gone dark outside while we've been talking, so I appreciate now people are getting ready for the evenings. So thank you for your attention. You can find our contact details on the side there. There's a QR code that also links to a page about the school's UNESCO chair around sport, physical activity and education for development. And on there, you'll find a section that Rachel leads around positive youth development through sport that might be of particular interest. There's also some further reading. They are linked. I'm not sure if you can click through them here, but if not, we can post them in the chat, and also Twitter or X handles as well if you'd like to do any tweeting. But other than that, I think we've got time for a few questions if there might be any.